And today I'm going to be speaking about my previous book, which is on Indian diasporas in Dubai, and hopefully you'll find some resonances with some of the migrant issues in Doha as well. Before I get started, I want to thank the Center for International and Regional Studies for inviting me, Georgetown SFS-Q, particularly Mehran Kamrava, Zara Babar, and Barb Gillis for putting this talk together. So the research for this book was conducted primarily in 2006 during Dubai's boom period, with follow-up visits through 2010. At that time, the landscape of Dubai was shifting drastically, as I'm sure many people in the room have read about or seen themselves. It was moving away from the older South Asian-dominated downtown neighborhoods around the Dubai Creek, which you can see here, and away from older forms of mercantilism and maritime trade. Instead, massive parastatal real estate development and the influx of multinational companies were both changing the geography of Dubai, moving its center further south along Sheikh Zayed Road. And I found this really funny tourist map today to show you. So here you can see that the creek is basically like not even, part of what's considered the main part of Dubai anymore. And even in Dubai, they call the new downtown is around the Burj Khalifa. Today, Dubai looks even more unrecognizable, even compared to when I last did field research there in 2010. The city-state was also utilizing more Westerners to showcase brand Dubai as an international and regional hub of business and tourism. So on many websites and real estate development, advertisements and things, you would see pictures of white people shopping, living, happy, in a way to kind of bring in a more international, westernized brand to the country, to create this international hub and regional hub of business and tourism. So when I arrived to do my research, I found a community, and I mean by community, the people living in these neighborhoods, that was both very settled, but also feeling more and more insecure. As rents had gone up, formerly lower middle class neighborhoods were being turned into luxury apartments, and Indians felt less job security than ever before. Yet, as anyone who has visited Dubai, and especially the older neighborhoods of Dera, Bur Dubai, Karama, among others, can sense in all sorts of ways, through people, products, forms of dress, languages, and foods and services offered, that Dubai remains a very South Asian and especially Indian city. And while South Asians are concentrated more in certain neighborhoods like the ones I just mentioned, they are also ubiquitous, making up over half of the population and working in every type of occupation and at every skill set. Unlike Indian communities in North America, where I was raised, or in Europe, however, and this is where most work on diaspora communities so far has been conducted, Indians have practically zero access to any form of permanency in Dubai. They cannot naturalize or even gain permanent residency, and like all foreign residents in the Gulf, are tied through the kafala system of migrant sponsorship to temporary renewable work visas, or they are dependents of parents or spouses with work visas. The primary question that drove my study then was how it is that Dubai is such an established South Asian city within the South Asian transnational imaginary when belonging in any official legal sense is unavailable. So what I'm going to explore today in the brief time I have is what I and other scholars have referred to as substantive or unofficial forms of citizenship, those that are non-passport based but are sometimes even stronger in the bonds they produce to place and community than legal status can offer or can confer. Thus, even though Indians are technically temporary and technically in the Gulf solely for economic accumulation, I found forms of belonging that cut even deeper than those I see in communities where they can naturalize, like in the case of my own Indian community in the United States. This is especially true of those Indians who are into their second, third, or even fourth generation in the Gulf, and especially true also of the business people who I interviewed who constantly would tell me about how they made Dubai, right? So I'm going to structure today's talk around what we anthropologists call an ethnographic vignette, a moment that illustrates and unpacks my theoretical interventions. Summarizing a book in about 25 minutes is not very possible, and of course I'm going to miss a lot, so please feel free to raise anything I missed or that you'd like me to elaborate on in the Q&A. So this next section is called Dubai is an air-conditioned bus. Tucked behind a main thoroughfare in Satwa, a neighborhood sandwiched between the wealthy areas of Jumeirah and Sheikh Zayed Road and populated primarily by middle and working class Asian and Arab residents, I found Rohit's cozy villa, which he and his family had been renting for almost 20 years. As an architect for a large state-owned construction company, Rohit was involved in several of Dubai's new high-rise projects. Over the course of his 30-plus years in the UAE, he had worked for an oil company in Abu Dhabi and partnered in 2 consulting and design firms. When I met him in 2006, he had just switched back from independent consulting to a salaried corporate position in order to ensure greater job security and make more money for his retirement. Like other Dubai Indians, Rohit, despite having spent his entire career and almost all of his adult life in the Gulf, considered himself a temporary migrant. He was raising his daughters with the Hindu cultural traditions of his Punjabi hometown, and he was remitting money to family in India while also slowly furnishing and building a home there to which he expected to retire. Rohit in many ways exemplifies the Indian middle-class dream in Dubai. He had managed to accumulate wealth during his time in the Gulf, had improved the living conditions of his extended and immediate family, and was setting himself up for a comfortable retirement in India, though when that would be was still not fixed, and he was very much evasive about when that was going to be in our interviews. When I asked him how he felt about living in the Gulf after having been there for so many years, his response was one that resonated with the narratives of many of my interlocutors. And I'll just put the quote up here so you can read it while I read it out loud. I say I'm an Indian. I live and work in Dubai. People say we have immigrated. I always say no, we have not immigrated. I am here as an economic immigrant. I came because opportunities are here to make money and save money. I work here, and that is why I live here. All human movement and immigrations are based on economic factors. Very few. US is different because they give you professional enhancement. But this place is all economic immigration. A self-identified middle-class Indian, Rohit made a strong distinction between immigration to other diasporic places like the United States, where people settle, and the Gulf, a place, according to him, solely for economic betterment, not for putting down roots. However, Rohit preferred to live in Dubai and had never actively pursued migrating elsewhere. His preference for the UAE over other countries was due to its cultural and geographical proximity to India and to its neoliberal market, which he fiercely believed in, a market in which anyone could succeed with enough patience and hard work, and where one was not beholden to the state in the form of taxes or civic duties. He likened the city to a bus, one that was fast-moving and also more luxurious than India, saying, Dubai is like a bus, an air-conditioned bus. Get onto the bus, don't bother if you get a seat or not, and then gradually you will settle down. Things will move on. Rohit's metaphor of Dubai as a bus is extremely poignant, I think, for it summarizes the sentiments expressed by many of my interlocutors about their migration and daily lives in Dubai. It is not coincidental that a middle-class Indian who feels he is an economic migrant chooses the image of a bus to describe Dubai. A bus is primarily a working and middle-class mode of travel. utterly unromantic and without attachment, merely a conduit from one place to another. That this bus is air-conditioned suggests that Dubai offers amenities and luxuries that might not be available in India, and that the passengers in this image may initially be unsure whether they will get seats or not, speaks not only to the economic challenges of moving to Dubai, but also to the certainty that eventually the city will be worth the ride. The middle-class Indians who form the majority of my interlocutors, like Rohit, overwhelmingly espouse discourses of economic accumulation that made Dubai a favorable location for immigration. They were supposedly able to belong to Dubai's market without any challenges to their national identity, and most of them were very clear to me that I'm Indian or I'm Pakistani, and that's it, nothing else. I'm not interested in Emirati citizenship or all of that. In fact, Rohit insisted that his daughters, unlike me, were more authentically Indian and less sullied by westernization than Indians in the US or UK. Middle-class Indians also reified the distinction between foreigner and national in Dubai through their insistence that they were good, self-enterprising foreign residents of the city and not the supposedly bad, welfare-reliant citizens. They were also insistent about their differences from poor migrant laborers who they felt gave Indians a bad reputation in Dubai, even as they expressed certain sympathies for their working conditions. While economic migration rationales by middle-class Indians contributed to the idea that non-citizens were outsiders to UAE culture and society, I argue that their middle-class subjectivities actually produced belongings that exceeded the economic and that staked certain political and affective claims to the city. These claims, in fact, came out in the very same interviews, including my interview with Rohit, where Indians denied any desire to belong beyond the economy. By exploring the narratives and daily activities of middle-class Indians, I consider in the book how different Dubai Indians in old Dubai, middle and working class salaried workers, merchants and businessmen, and second-generation young people, staked claims to the city through historical memory, urban belonging, and cultural proximity between India and the UAE. They considered Dubai an extension of India. In fact, many people felt that it was precisely the Indianness of Dubai that made it a favorable destination for migration. Now, I would hear people call Dubai India West, India's westernmost state, a clean Bombay. I mean, lots of metaphors that suggested that Dubai was part of South Asia. Thus, even though Emirati national identity and citizenship were inaccessible to them, it was the access that Indians had to cultural and social resources in Dubai and the sheer number of South Asians in the city that made moving there seem less like international migration and more like being in another part of India. What made the downtown neighborhoods of Dubai feel like home and extensions of India was the constant traffic in people, goods, and information between South Asia and the Gulf. Several of my interviewees pointed out that Indian matrimonial sites even include the Gulf region, and especially Dubai. Families considered Gulf residents to be appropriate, if not even desirable, potential mates for their children because living in places like Dubai was not seen to dilute Indian cultural values or provide any meaningful culture shock. Strolling through the retail areas and souks of these downtown neighborhoods that I spoke of, like Mina Bazaar in Bur Dubai, the commercial hubs near the Dubai Creek, for example, one can hear Bollywood ringtones on cell phones, smell food cooking in small dhabas and chaat places, see Hindu deities displayed in stores and offices, and observe a wide cross-section of South Asian consumers, from women in saris shopping in groups for fabric, to British Indian tourists bargaining over electronics, to single Afghani and Pakistani men in pajama kurta shopping for simple gold chains and bangles to send home. And here's an example of the kinds of advertising that you would see in downtown Dubai, which is clearly aimed at a South Asian population. According to Janice, who worked in a real estate office in Karama, Her fashion choices were dictated by what was happening in India, because the most current items were always available in the shops, and because other women were also quite aware of the Bombay and Delhi trends. Thus, part of participating in everyday life in Dubai was also through practices of consumption. And in India, Gulf products were often valued as signs of status and cosmopolitanism that marked Dubai Indians' diasporic privilege and set them apart from those at home. I've even heard stories that in certain parts of Kerala and more rural or poorer communities, even Carrefour shopping bags have a cachet because they indicate something that is Khaliji or Gulfi. So consumer citizenship is something that I look at in my book as a form of belonging. One other specific form of urban diasporic citizenship produced through the processes of migrating, living, and working in Dubai that I want to linger on a bit more than the others in this talk is racial consciousness. This form of identity created a sense of distinction from Indians in India, and it produced identifications with other South Asians in the Gulf, and identifications between Indians from different regions who normally would think of themselves as very distinct. Middle-class Indians developed racial consciousness through their experiences of systematic discrimination and racial hierarchies in Dubai. However, while they experienced discrimination based on race and nationality in almost every aspect of their lives, they also expressed very particular middle-class identifications that relied on their belief in a neoliberal free market economy. On the surface, racism should be contradictory to the idea of a free market in which all people, regardless of origin or circumstance, are welcome onto a level playing field of economic opportunity. Dubai Indians' pervasive experiences of formal and informal racism did not negate their belief in the Emirates' free market. Rather, these experiences actually catalyzed their belief in and production of an open economy distinct from a closed nation. They located their experiences of racism primarily within newer shifts in Dubai's economy that were bringing in more white Western expatriates and deteriorating what many felt used to be a special position for Indians in the UAE. And I heard this a lot from older merchant communities in particular. It was the failures of New Dubai and its pace of development, and the shifting demographics and geographies of the city, my informants claimed, that impeded on what used to be a much more truly free market. This nostalgia, especially among longer-term residents for a better Dubai, was a way of staking claim to the city and producing narratives of historical belonging, even as it was a criticism of the state and of newer entrants into the economy. Now, some of this I'm sure is familiar from the Qatar context as well. Discrimination is embedded into the employment structure in terms of salary and benefits and into migration procedures, making South Asians feel they have the least ability to negotiate or protest against company demands due to their higher levels of job and visa insecurity. Many people would tell me that they were working in jobs they were overqualified to do simply because higher level jobs were not slated for Indians or other Asians. And just as they claimed that whites got more pay for less skills, my informants also related many incidents in which the standards that white and Emirati workers were held to were much lower than those expected from Indians. The quality of life differences between South Asian and Western expatriates are not only the result of a hierarchy of employment opportunities based on nationality, but are built into the very process of migration itself. Unlike most Europeans and North Americans, South Asians need a visa to enter the UAE as tourists, so they cannot stay in the country unless they are employed or are dependent of someone who has employment. This means that residency in the country is almost completely reliant upon maintaining a steady job. Many Indians in Dubai with whom I spoke had procured employment through recruiting companies while still at home, a process that required giving large sums of money to headhunters for paperwork, visa processing, and travel expenses. Others had arrived in the UAE on a visit visa to look for a job, after which they had to fly back home and return on a proper work visa. So there's a lot of upfront monetary investment that goes into migration. Upon arrival in the UAE, many of my informants, even middle-class professionals, had their passports seized by their companies, supposedly to prevent flight, and sometimes also found that salaries were lower than promised or garnished for a range of added expenses, resulting in a debt situation that prevented them from saving and remitting what they had expected for several months or even years. Foreigners who cannot obtain a visa upon arrival must return immediately to their home country for a minimum of 6 months, and this was the case at the time of my research, it might have changed, upon losing their job before they are able to apply for new employment. If a foreign resident tries to switch positions without the current employer's permission, he can be put back on a blacklist that leads to deportation and the inability to land another job in the country. Because of these rules and restrictions, South Asians were constantly and strategically maneuvering between the subcontinent and the Gulf as part of the practice of Gulf employment. This movement added to the transient nature of Dubai's Indian communities, but also to the constant sense of connection that made the Dubai Creek neighborhoods feel like extensions of India. And to give you an example, I mean, I don't know if any of you have been to these neighborhoods during Diwali or any other kind of major Indian event, but this is a celebration in Karama, which is a South Asian-dominated neighborhood, upon India's win during a World Cup or some football game. So you can see the sense of nationalism and community even while they are outside of India. So to move back to this process of discrimination, we tend to think and have this rationale that, you know, home country living standards are less for people in India, and therefore that is why pay scales are set at particular ways, or it's harder to lure Westerners here than it is to lure people from less developed countries. And this is why companies in the Gulf often set pay scales based on country or region of origin. This was particularly true during my time in Dubai, though it has changed somewhat due to the UAE government's efforts to improve the migration system, especially for low-wage workers from Asia. Employers paid South Asians significantly less money than they paid Westerners for the same jobs, and without any of the housing, schooling, or other benefits that were normalized into the job offers that most North Americans, Europeans, and Australians usually received. Citizens of the UAE, even those who were less qualified, received some of the highest salaries, and companies were required to hire at least a certain proportion of citizens or pay higher fees for each employee's visa. This set up a highly stratified racial, ethnic, and class system in the UAE, which spilled over into the social and cultural lives of my Indian informants, particularly at a time when mega development projects and pushes for multinational investment were focused on westernizing the face of Dubai by drawing in more white Western expatriates. Thus, South Asians in Dubai lived within a tiered hierarchy of migration and employment where they had the least job security and the highest financial strain at practically any skill level or rank, whether office clerk or executive. So, I mean, I think this is very important because when you're paying for your children's schooling, when you're renting your own apartment, when you're renting your own car, if we take these things into account, actually the proportion of remittances, when we tend to think that, oh, South Asians remit all their money, right? Or people from this country remit all their money, or foreign residents in general remit all their money. But in fact, South Asians were spending a much higher proportion of their earnings within the UAE than most of my American or European colleagues who had a lot of these benefits paid for by their companies. There were also other forms of racism in Dubai that were less institutionalized. For example, some people related getting told that their English was not proper enough, even if they were educated in the UK or the US, relating not being allowed into nightclubs and bars. And these experiences of discriminatory practices within the workplace and outside of the workplace were commonplace for Dubai Indians. Through racial consciousness, Dubai Indians rehearsed citizenship to Dubai while disavowing interest in belonging to the Emirati nation. Dubai Indians, therefore, are not simply passive exceptions to citizenship, but are integral to bounding a form of citizenship against which they frame their own subjectivities and positions within the UAE. In light of recent changes in Dubai that reduced their opportunities for financial success, Dubai Indians' narratives of economic freedom and middle-class achievement came into conflict with the hierarchical racial and national divisions within the city and brought into greater relief these new forms of subjectification and claims to citizenship. Therefore, the lived experiences of Indians in downtown Dubai contained within them not only market-based narratives, but also scales and forms of what I call substantive or unofficial citizenship that extended beyond these accounts of voluntary, temporary economic migration. Middle-class and elite South Asians, for example, espouse certain neoliberal market values of free enterprise and liberal ideas about equal treatment, while participating in non-liberal forms of patronage and exploitation that reproduce social stratification and forms of hierarchical citizenship among the Indian diaspora in Dubai. This was particularly true in the case of long-standing Indian merchant communities, who regularly hired workers from India and utilized ethnic networks to justify lower pay and certain forms of exploitation. The Emirati state actually provides opportunities for wealthy expatriates to own businesses and govern over their own compatriots, in effect behaving like citizens of the country and participating in some of the substantive benefits of the supposed rentier state. So while it is technically the citizens who are kafils, in practice, what I argue and what I found out through my research is that many Indian businessmen in Dubai who had are responsible for the day-to-day governance of migrants, and these migrants are usually from their home countries. For example, I interviewed many Indian businessmen in Dubai who had silent Emirati partners and were effectively running profitable ethnic enterprises based on recruitment of employees from their home regions or villages. Often employees were housed together and bused to the work site with little free time and very low pay. Many businessmen lauded the ability to run these types of ethnic businesses with little government interference and without having to pay many taxes as forms of freedom that they preferred over Western or Indian-style democratic rights. So it's really interesting how freedom gets redefined here in a way that is based on exploitation of their own compatriots. In fact, they overwhelmingly told me that they would not accept Emirati citizenship and the privileges that came with it, even if it was available to them. The legitimacy and sovereignty of the Gulf Arab states, therefore, are reliant on the practices of informal citizenship by their large foreign resident populations, particularly South Asians, who have long-standing ties to the region and participate in acts of governance while simultaneously narrating themselves as outsiders to national identity. And almost done, I promise. Just a couple more minutes, I'm moving to my conclusion. Unlike media representations of Dubai, in which the city is symbolized by its skyscrapers, hotels, labor camps, and shopping malls, which we're all familiar with, Rohit's bus metaphor speaks to an alternate experience, one that is far removed from the very projects he himself is helping to construct, and one that acknowledges both the ephemerality and rootedness of Indian existences in Dubai and the UAE. Moreover, the image of the bus, or as shown here in Abra, which is a water taxi that many downtown residents take across the Dubai Creek to get to work, the bus, or the Abra, exemplifies a mobility that is particular to Dubai. It is constantly moving, and people are constantly getting on and off. This is different from the forms of immigrant mobility that shape our understandings of migration in other places, like the United States or Great Britain, where family movement supposedly ends in settlement, and where being mobile implies the ability to increasingly integrate into the host society. While their inability to be legally permanent, state narratives about them as guest workers and their own migration stories placed Indians squarely outside of Emirati national identity, but firmly inside the economy. My interlocutors' histories, actions, and narratives also indicated that Indians in Dubai were integral to the operation of governance, to national identity and citizenship, and to the functioning of Dubai's liberalized and globalized market forms. They were, therefore, as the title of my book suggests, impossible citizens. For while they disavowed belonging to Dubai and professed Indian nationalisms, they nevertheless staked certain historical, cultural, and geographic claims to the city. In fact, the disavowal of any desire for official citizenship in the UAE both intensified their informal modes of belonging and strengthened an ever-porous division between nationals and foreigners that the state was heavily invested in maintaining. The historical and contemporary entanglements between the Gulf and South Asia mean that in many ways Dubai is experienced as an extension of the subcontinent for all residents of the city, although increasingly it is becoming easier for more elite Western expats and Emirati citizens to live in segregated communities that allow them to ignore the ubiquity of South Asia within Dubai. The experiences of Indians in Dubai are built on decades of living both day-to-day and within firmly rooted communities. My colleague Yasser El-Shashtawi writes that the Indian-dominated neighborhoods of downtown Dubai, those that are ignored in the literature and considered exotic by Western expatriates, are highly important, quote, places where everyday life is taking place, even as they are marked by a lack of permanence. While the guests at the Burj Al Arab, Dubai's 7-star hotel, and the guest workers of Sonapur, Dubai's largest labor camp, have captured our attention thus far, they are not indicative of an entire city, nor are they markers of a two-dimensional form of globalization. Dubai is not a non-place without culture or a city of smoke and mirrors. The Anthropologist Project, put as simply as possible, is one of narrating the ordinariness of a place. My book, I hope, addresses the ephemerality of Dubai and Dubai Indians, not as fantasy or obscenity, but rather as a quite mundane, and therefore anthropologically very important, aspect of life for Indian foreign residents, the exceptions to citizenship that are most representative, yet impossible citizens of this not so exceptional urban space. Thank you.